Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. This is one of our normal Tuesday night webinars we do with GlobalNet 21 and where we try to cover a number of issues that are usually very important and a different one every week. And in this particular webinar, we're going to look at a particular interesting topic that centers around the whole area of social mobility. People have for some time now believed that if you can create a society where merit is rewarded, and merit is, skill, knowledge plus effort, if you can reward that, you can increase social mobility. And so many politicians of all parties have embraced the idea of a meritocratic society. Because they believe that if you have equal opportunity or equality of opportunity, then meritocracy is a way for anyone to go, if you like, to take an American phrase, from rags to riches. Now, whether that's true or not is something we're going to discuss today. And one of the first people to question it was someone called Michael Young. And he wrote a book called The Rise of the Meritocracy. Now, Michael Young is quite a famous person, sociologist, written several books, including one with Peter Wilmot on how on the East End, housing in the East End, and poverty back in the 1950s. He helped to write the 1945 Labour Party manifesto. He then became disillusioned with doing things from the top down and started looking at how you could create community-generated activities, instrumental in getting the Open University going, the College of Health, and a lot more. But he also questioned, and this is one of the reasons why he left doing things in a top-down way. He questions a meritocratic society. And that's what we're going to discuss here today. And almost as famous as Michael Young, and he was very famous, we've got with us Terry Loane. And you can see him here. He's got a new webcam, so he's in brilliant Technicolor. And Terry's going to go through that with us. So let me say, first of all, what Terry will be doing is he'll be making a presentation of about 15 minutes and then ask you to make comments, and then he'll come back and do another short one near the end for 5 minutes, and then get more comments from you as well then, and then we'll conclude the webinar. The webinar will be recorded, so you'll be able to see it. I hope it'll be edited and ready tomorrow. Okay, so Terry, thanks for joining us. Now we're going to go over to you so you can tell us about meritocracy.
Thanks very much, Francis. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. As Francis said, I'm going to do the presentation in two parts. The first part, the main part, will be 15 or maybe slightly more minutes. Then there'll be time for questions and comments. And then the conclusions will be 5 to 10 minutes and further time for questions after that. The reason I've separated it into two is because I think some of my conclusions you might think are a bit outrageous. So I thought I'd leave the outrageous bit until the very end. Now, there are two historical starting points for tonight's webinar. The first historical starting point in this story about merit and meritocracy is the 2nd of June, 1870. Because on that date in 1870, something quite radical happened in the British civil service. They introduced competitive exams to get into the civil service, and at the same time, they introduced a system of promotion by merit. Now, that all seems pretty much common sense to us these days, but at the time, it was actually regarded as being extremely radical. Before 1870, appointment in the civil service, and indeed status in society in general, wasn't determined by any perception of effort, but it was determined by patronage and by privilege. And so this was a major shift. And I think we would all say it was a shift for the better at the time. But of course, privilege and patronage haven't gone away at all from society. We still live in the UK, in a country that chooses its head of state, not on the basis of any perceived merit, but on the basis of who the person's parents were. And patronage hasn't gone away either. We still live in a country, I would say, where to some extent, who you know is as important as what you know. It has been suggested, and I put it no stronger than that, it has been suggested that Toby Young's appointment to the Office for Students, which was very short-lived, but it has been suggested that that just might have had something to do with patronage rather than merit, given that he was a chum of Boris Johnson. They were both at Oxford, and they both have written for The Spectator. Boris Johnson's brother, Joe Johnson, was the Minister for Universities at the time, and it's not for me to say, but there was certainly a suspicion that patronage as much as merit was involved there. And there's a sort of irony in me talking about Toby Young, because the second historical starting point for tonight's webinar was a book that Toby Young's father, Michael Young, wrote in 1958, as Francis has already mentioned. And here is the book. It's an unusual book. I call it a satirical fantasy essay because it purports to be written by an imaginary author in the future, in the year 2033, an imaginary sociologist who lives in a distinctly dystopian Britain, but who really is a fan for meritocracy. And it's really important to realize that Michael Young invented the word meritocracy for this book. The word didn't exist before he wrote the book. And the book is a satire. It's meant to be a warning. So when he invented the word meritocracy, he intended it to have a derogatory, negative meaning. The imaginary writer of the book has a sort of no-nonsense, there is no alternative voice. He, and we are told that it is a he takes for granted that all sensible people know that we need to separate the sheep and the goats as early as possible in life. All sensible people will endorse enlightened modern methods, to quote from chapter 5. Now, the book uses some quite horrible language, as if it were perfectly acceptable. In particular, and the imaginary writer seems to like the word stupid. And I couldn't resist this morning. I was in a coffee shop and I saw this sign in this coffee shop this morning: no stupid people beyond this point. And that actually sums up the book in a way. Let me give you 3 examples of what I call this horrible use of language in the book. The difficulty was not to get the able to stay on at school, but to get the stupid to leave school and put up with the manual jobs for which their low intelligence fitted them. Another quotation: if in the adult world, as much as in the school, the stupid are kept together, they are not reminded of their inferiority. It gets worse. Another quotation: once all the geniuses are amongst the elite and all the morons amongst the workers, what meaning can equality have? Remember, please, that this is not Michael Young talking, it is his imaginary writer. Now, all predictions of the future have one thing in common. They are all, at least to some degree, wrong. Actually, Young predicts many things correctly in the book. For example, he predicts an increase in income and wealth inequality. And of course, we've seen that over the last 30 years. He also predicts a severe weakening of trade unions, and we've also seen that. But I'm going to focus on just 3 significant predictions in the book, and I'm going to compare how these predictions relate to the actual reality that we live in. The first prediction is the emergence of a disillusioned underclass. There's a really chilling footnote right at the end of The Rise of the Meritocracy, where the imaginary publisher of the book says, I'm awfully sorry, but we haven't been able to check the proofs with the writer because he was murdered in the riots of 2033. So Young is predicting a complete breakdown in society. Now, we have had riots more recently in 2011, but we haven't had a complete breakdown of society yet. But I think if you just think back to 2016, no matter what view you take of the the referendum here in the UK or of the presidential election in the United States, I think people on all sides accept that a significant factor in both votes was the emergence of a group of people who felt that life wasn't being fair to them, that they weren't being given what they wanted or deserved. So I think we can say that the emergence of a disillusioned underclass is something that we have seen happening. The second thing is the uncritical acceptance of meritocracy as a good thing. The imaginary writer of the book, he sees nothing at all wrong with the meritocratic system, even though, you know, society is breaking down around him. And yet what we've seen happening, and Francis mentioned this in his introduction, we actually see that many of our politicians now have a sort of uncritical acceptance of meritocracy as a good thing, even though the word was meant to be a warning. Here's an extract from an article Michael Young wrote in 2001 about his book. He wrote, "I have been sadly disappointed by my 1958 book, The Rise of the Meritocracy. I coined a word which has gone into general circulation and most recently found a prominent place in the speeches of Mr. Blair," who was Prime Minister at the time, and that Michael Young wrote this, of course, in 2001. "The book was a satire meant to be a warning, which needless to say has not been heeded, against what might happen to Britain between 1958 and the imagined final revolt against the meritocracy in 2033. The Prime Minister Blair has caught on to the word without realizing the dangers of what he is advocating." And here are some actual examples of Tony Blair using the word meritocracy. In April 1997, in other words, just before he became Prime Minister, Tony Blair said, "I want a society based on meritocracy." A couple of months after he was elected, in 1997, he said, "The Britain of the elite is over. The new Britain is a meritocracy." And 2 years later, Tony Blair says, "The old establishment is being replaced by a new, larger, more meritocratic middle class." And here is one of his colleagues, Harriet Harman, speaking in 2010. She said, but for the sake of the right of every individual to reach their full potential, for the sake of a strong and meritocratic economy," and she goes on to make a good point about pay inequality, in fact. But nevertheless, these politicians sort of accepted uncritically the idea of meritocracy, and yet the very word itself was coined as a warning. I find that remarkable. The third prediction of the future is the elimination of competition. This is something actually, I think, quite difficult to get one's head around. I would say that we live in a world at the moment that is both very unequal and also very competitive. I call it a hyper-competitive world. For example, an education white paper that was published in 2010 when Michael Gove was Secretary of State for Education, it states in this paper that each of us must become the authors of our own life stories. In other words, if you don't achieve, it's your fault. You haven't played the competition game well enough. So we live in this very competitive world, but it's interesting that the world that is predicted in the book, competition has been virtually eliminated. And the reason for that is that they have, allegedly, made intelligence testing so scientific and so correct and so efficient that now you can give people an IQ test at the age of 3 and it will be reliable and valid. So in other words, the book says that by the age of 3, we know who the sheep are going to be and who the goats are going to be. We know the difference between the geniuses and the morons. So they could be separated at that point. So as well as having grammar schools, you'd have grammar nursery schools and grammar primary schools. So no need for any competition, because the scientific development of intelligence testing has done away with the need for that. Now, so the elimination of competition is something I would say that hasn't come true. Now, if you do eliminate competition, then you also minimize the importance of effort, because what you're saying is, oh, we can work out who the intelligent people are, so we don't have to have competitive exams or anything like that. But notwithstanding this minimizing of effort, we get this formula in the book, in chapter 5, I think, of the book, I plus E equals M, which stands for intelligence plus effort equals merit. Now, you must remember, this formula was meant as a satirical joke, a sick joke, because Michael Young realized just how stupid it was to try to reduce the complexity of human capability and achievement just to a simple, simplistic mathematical formula. So this is meant to be a joke. But the remarkable thing, and it still shocks me, the remarkable thing is these days, if you look at books, if you look at articles, if you go online, you will see that people have uncritically accepted this sick joke of an equation. You will find people saying ability plus effort equals merit. I've also seen talent times effort equals merit. And the people who write this don't seem to realize that they are copying something which was meant as a satirical joke. Now, I want to talk, before that we just get to the end of this first part of the presentation, I wanted to talk about the concept of false gods. Now, by a false god, I mean the situation in which our view of the world, and more importantly, the words we use to describe the world, are based on beliefs and assumptions that have been discredited. So the ideas are out of date or even disproved, but somehow we carry on using the same vocabulary out of habit. And we all do it. I did it last week on the GlobalNet 21 Facebook page when I was writing something. It was a discussion about the Carillion business, and I was writing something about PFI contracts. And I said the problem with PFI contracts is that the financial risk ends up falling on the taxpayer. I should have said it ends up falling on the government. By saying it falls on the taxpayer, I think I was just accepting neoliberal words. Now, I'm not talking really about economy tonight, but I just give that as an example of how, if we're not careful, we keep on slipping back to outdated ideas. And I'm going to say that each of these ideas in the formula, ability stroke talent plus effort equals merit, each of those is in some way a false god. Actually, if we'd had more time, I would have wanted to add 2 more false gods to the list. I would have wanted to add social mobility, which is closely related to this, and the Great British Bake Off, both as being false gods. But perhaps Francis will invite me back to do a webinar entitled Why the Great British Bake Off is damaging mental health. I should say other similar television programs are available. But for now, we'll limit ourselves to ability, talent, and effort. Ability, first of all. We all know that human capability varies hugely between individuals. But we also know that it's complex. You can't tie it down. Human beings continuously surprise us, as long as we don't have a closed mind, by what they can do and by what they cannot do. Now, at one time, there was this view that you could actually measure ability and talent through IQ tests. I think almost nobody believes that anymore, actually. You have Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. You have the never-ending argument about the degree to which intelligence, or perhaps we should say ability, is inherited or determined by environment. So nobody really believes in this simplistic view of measuring ability and talent anymore. But I'm afraid it lives on in the words we use, and we have to be careful about that. It's the same with effort. We all know people who are rather lazy. We also know people who work incredibly hard to achieve something that they really want to achieve. So human beings vary in effort, but likewise, we can't measure it. It's crazy to say that you could ever have an effort coefficient and say this person's effort is worth 98 and that person's effort is worth 120 or whatever. But actually, in terms of false gods, there are 2 much more dangerous things behind effort. the first dangerous thing is that if we're not careful, effort, or the worship of effort, can result in ridiculous academic pressure on children. We all know that there's a mental health crisis amongst young people. We also know from research that the pressure that young people are put under in schools is a significant factor in this mental health. But we carry on saying to young people, you must work harder, you must try harder. I like to think that we are getting to solve the huge scandal of sexual abuse of children. I sometimes wonder whether we're just replacing it by another form of child abuse, academic abuse. Now, the third false god, which is the last thing I'm going to talk about before the first break, is merit. And you see, the interesting thing is, to go back to Michael Young's book, throughout the book, there is just this assumption that we need to have a group of clever people who we select and we pay them more and they get the interesting jobs, and that we need to have that in order for there to be effective social and public good to be delivered. But do we believe that this has worked? Do we really think that the people who run our institutions, who run our corporations, and who run our governments are doing a good job? Do we really believe that this business of merit is working? I don't think we do. So here are some of my suggestions about what the uncritical applications of meritocracy how they can be damaging. I suggest that meritocracy can result in individual mental ill health. I've just explained that. I think it can lead to social breakdown and disintegration. And I think also it fails to deliver on its promise of effective social and public good. So I'd like to pause there and invite any comments via the chat and via Francis on what I've said so far, and then I'll go on with the with my own tentative conclusions about how we deal with what I call the dilemma of merit.
Okay, well, thank you, Terry, for going through that. And that was quite a good polemic argument about meritocracy and why you think it has limitations. Can I ask people, if you've got questions or comments, please type them up and we'll put them to Terry and he'll take them up. Let me begin by asking you, I mean, as I understand it, what Michael Young is saying, is he not, is that meritocracy really is just a system for replacing one elite for another. And what he sees as being the problem is that those people who believe in a meritocratic society and genuinely and sincerely do not take account power. And that is that when you replace one elite with another, the new one wants to keep their position. So whatever happens, any meritocratic society will become rigid and you can't move away from it without disruption.
I think that's right. And certainly an idea that comes out in the second half of the book is that the people who were the enthusiasts for merit and meritocracy felt that they were moving away from the idea of privilege and aristocracy. But in the end, it goes back to the same thing. Now, I think that's partly because, of course, another assumption by the imaginary person who wrote the book is that intelligence is inherited. Therefore, that tends to cement and harden the stratification of society. So you try to get away from a society of privilege, and you end up just reproducing it. And I think that's a key idea of his book. But of course, that raises the dilemma: what are you going to do? Are you just going to accept patronage and privilege as the way we run the world?
But, you know, some people argue, and I think it was one political science, Pareto, that says democracy isn't really bottom up at all. It's about the circulation of elites. It's about changing elites, because you need elites somehow to govern and to coordinate. I'm not agreeing with that view. I don't, in fact, but some people argue that. And meritocracy is just a different way of circulating elites.
Yeah, I think you're leading into my conclusions, Francis, in a very nice way, because I too would tend to reject the notion that you need to have elites to rule society from the top down, or to rule organizations from the top down. And that's really what my conclusions focus on.
Okay. We won't go into the bake-off now, but Pamela is very curious as to what you mean. So,
okay, well,
okay, explain that, because otherwise Pamela will go away very disappointed.
Okay, I've nothing against the bake-off program that I don't have against several other programs, and the other programs I would include in the same concerns are the Young Musician of the Year program, Britain's Got Talent, and oh, the name's gone. What's the dancing program called? Just remind me.
Strictly.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's Strictly Come Dancing. And the reason I'm concerned about these programs is this. Think about sport. Now, competition is an essential element of sport. You can't have sport without competition. I suppose you can kick a ball around the back garden if you want to, but that's not really football. Sport works by having simple rules and by having a simple measure of who the winner is, the person who has the most goals, or the person who throws the javelin the furthest. And it's governed by simple rules, and competition is of the essence. I say that competition is not of the essence in terms of making music, making bread, two of my favorite things to do in life, by the way. Dancing, not one of my favorite things to do in life, but there you go. And I think the difficulty of these programs is it exaggerates the competitive nature of life by pretending that everything has to be competitive, and it doesn't. When you get to the final of the Young Musician of the Year competition, the judge always starts off afterwards by saying the same thing. Oh, all these people were so good, I wish they could all be winners. And I feel at that stage by saying, well, just stop, because it's absolutely stupid to compare a trombonist with a harp player and to say that you can place these people in rank order. And it's this injection of meaningless competition into everything that I think can be so damaging. But if you tell me that I'm taking these television programs far too seriously, then I'm happy to accept that, and I'll just watch something else.
Yeah, I had a question. This is more about me, myself. I have a son who is pianist, and he is participating in the BBC Musician of the Year, or what? Yeah, the program. I agree with you. You can't compare a pianist and a saxophonist. But I don't know. I really don't know. I'm asking you a question. How can you motivate young people to focus on something and try to do better of what they are doing?
Well, I think my answer to that, and I mean, as some of you may know, the first 26 years of my career were spent in music education. I would say that young people are motivated to do music and to do it as well as possible because it's something that's worth doing, you know. And I've known, dozens, probably hundreds of people who have done that. I play the piano myself. But and I, even as a youngster, I didn't actually like, though I was quite happy to do exams, but I didn't like those competitive music competitions. I know the young musician competition doesn't work like this, but to me there was something, even as a youngster, bizarre about 20 people all playing the same piece one after the other. I mean, it just seemed weird to me. I think, you see, once we can get out of the habit of thinking that everything in life has got to be competitive, then we can get into the habit of thinking about intrinsic motivation. I mean, people play music because they want to do it and they want to get it right. You know, the story I like is of the the great saxophonist Charlie Parker, who went when he was very young to do a gig, and they said, we're playing such and such a piece in such and such a key, and he couldn't do it. So he went home and he practiced every jazz piece he knew in every key there was, just so that he could do it. Not so that he'd win some competition, but just because he was motivated to do that. But having said that, I do hope that your son does very well in music, because that's been my life, music.
I'll take Peter's out, because I think Peter is sort of saying a bit what you're saying, Terry. I mean, he's saying, down at a certain level, there is a lot of expertise and there is a lot of skills. But the people who rise to the top in a meritocracy aren't necessarily the people that do have those skills. They're the people who had them, or they know how to achieve power. And then they use that power in a way to suppress the people who have real skills and real expertise, who, if left to their own, could probably create a much better society.
Peter, I couldn't have imagined a better introduction to my conclusions than that. So thank you. I mean, I can only answer that or move on from there, from that, by going into my conclusions. Now, do you want me to do that now, Francis? Are there any other questions I should address now?
I mean, seeing everyone stealing your thunder and your conclusion, I would say go into it, and then we'll take some questions up from that. Right. Okay.
Okay. So my concluding sort of hypothesis is, and I think it goes right back to what Peter has said, is I suggest that we do not need steep hierarchies because collegiate approaches work better. And that goes straight back to what Peter was saying, that the people lower down very often know what they're doing, and the people who get to the top are good at getting to the top, and not necessarily at doing the job in hand. And what I'd like to do is to give 5 examples of what I mean by collegiate approaches that could, to some extent, replace the assumption behind meritocracy, the assumption of steep hierarchies. Right. The first approach I'm suggesting is just to have flatter and more consultative hierarchies. And the example I would give of this is the very first school I taught at. Now, this was 1971 to 1974, so it's a long time ago. And it was a small secondary school. It didn't have a 6th form. Now, that school had a head teacher and a deputy head teacher and a senior mistress, because that's what happened in those days. So I suppose in today's vocabulary, you could say they were the senior management team. But if you'd gone into any school in the early 1970s and started talking about a senior management team, nobody would have had a clue what you were talking about, because that wasn't the way it worked. The head teacher of that first school I taught at was very proud that he had never had a formal meeting in the school that wasn't attended by all the teaching staff. Now, I'm sure there would have been informal chats involving the head and the deputy and the senior mistress, but they had no formal meetings. So the whole thing was done on the basis of a consultative hierarchy. I can still remember those meetings because it was a small school. We used to sit around in a circle. I mean, later on in my career, teaching in bigger schools, I can remember staff meetings with everybody sitting in a row and the head teacher sitting at the front looking at us. But these were really genuinely consultative. The word democratic is perhaps a bit strong to use. And the other thing about the flatter hierarchy is if I compare my salary in 1971 as a first-year teacher with what the head teacher was earning, the difference proportionately would have been far, far less than it is these days between a rank and file first-year teacher and a head teacher. And the other key thing here, which I think goes back to Peter's point, is that those 3 people in what we now call the senior management team, they all taught. The deputy head and the senior mistress, I think, taught a pretty full timetable, and the head teacher also did some teaching. So it didn't feel at all as if there was a separate management sort of structure from above. The second example I'm going to give is what I call taking it in turns. A great student friend of mine has just retired, actually, a few months ago as an academic at Trinity College in Dublin. He still is, a historian. And what they did there in the history department, or maybe it's the medieval history department, anyway, in his department at Trinity College Dublin, the senior academics would take it in turn to spend a year doing the head of a department role, doing the administrative and management role. So you wouldn't have one sort of professor who was a head of department. And funny enough, I was talking to my brother this afternoon about this, and he said at Goldsmiths College Music Department in London, which he attended, it was exactly the same thing. So you have this taking it in turns, and that means you don't have managers who are outside of the professional culture, because they carry on being teachers and academics. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if that business of taking it in turns is fading out in universities, but that's because of the ridiculous hoops that government makes universities and departments jump through. So you almost need professional compliance mongers, as I call them, to take on the management role. I wouldn't be surprised if it was much more difficult for that to happen now, but that's because of things that have gone wrong in how universities are run, I would suggest. The third example of a collegiate approach is quite wacky: random promotion. And I only read about this when I was preparing for this webinar tonight. And there are 3 academic studies which show, and I think this is very funny, they show that if you promote people randomly rather than on merit, the results, they suggest, are just as good, if not better. So this is turning on its head the development that started in 1870 in the civil service. Now, but you can see how this can work, because you probably know, or you may have heard of the Peter Principle. The Peter Principle is the idea that in a hierarchy, everybody ends up doing a job they're no good at. So you can imagine a teacher gets promoted to be a head of a department. If they're a good head of a department, they get promoted to being a deputy head. If they're a good deputy head, they get promoted to being a head. If they're a good head, they might go on these days to be an executive head or some such nonsense. Or in the old days, they would have gone on to being a director of education. Or some such nonsense. But if at any point somebody gets promoted and they aren't seen to do a good job, they'll stick. So the rank and file teacher is seen to be good, becomes a head of department, seen to be good, becomes a deputy head, but isn't much good at that. So they stick there. So the idea of the Peter Principle is that we all end up doing something we're no good at. And the idea of random promotion cuts across that. But actually, I don't see random promotion as having much of a chance. However, the next example I think is fascinating, the Voortzorg approach. I hope my Dutch pronunciation is reasonably good. Now, the Voortzorg, I'll just get their full name from here. Yes, the Voortzorg Neighborhood Care Program in the Netherlands is a program for community nurses, people who do the jobs that in this country would be done by district nurses and by people we used to call home help. In other words, these are nurses who go into people's homes, help them to live independently when they've maybe come out of hospital. And the guy who invented this had an important principle. Voortzorg divides its employees into teams of 12. And the teams are completely self-managing. There are no managers. They sort it out themselves. And the fascinating thing about this approach is that it really works. And if you find, if you look at client satisfaction from Voortzorg, the client satisfaction is extremely high. If you look at employee satisfaction, that's extremely high. The nurses who do this love it. If you look at the extent to which the clients regain their independence as they're getting better, that's extremely good. And you see this Voortzorg approach applies the same philosophy to the clients, namely, we will help you to live as independently as possible. It applies exactly the same approach to its employees. We will help you work as independently as possible through cooperative self-management. And the final thing, the good news about the Boort-Sorg approach, is it saves a huge amount of money. It's a social enterprise, so it doesn't aim to make a profit, but apparently every year it ends up with a surplus because they manage to do an effective job cheaply without any hierarchy. I think there, I don't know much about the healthcare centre, but I think there are experiments in this country, actually more particularly in Scotland, with the Boort-Sorg approach. I do suggest looking that up on the internet. It's fascinating. And well, I hope I'm not going on too long in my enthusiasm about this, but the final example comes really from the world of politics rather than from the world of institutions, and that's sortition. A few months ago, we had an excellent webinar on new approaches to democracy from Patrick Chalmers, and he talked about sortition, which is it's really like extending the jury system from the world of the law into the world of politics. So if a country has a huge constitutional question coming up, you invite people at random to form a group who will explore the evidence and report back, just like you would with a jury. So, so instead of doing what we did with the EU referendum and getting people on both sides to spend millions of pounds telling us lies, so that people could then decide which lies they believed and which lies they thought were lies, you would do it rather differently. And they did this in Ireland with the issue of changing the law on abortion. And there was a very good video which Patrick introduced to us during the seminar. Fascinating to see people, because abortion is like the EU in that people have got very emotional and very fixed ideas about it. But so sortition is, if you like, the political version. So those are 5 collegiate approaches which I maintain show that if we can organize society in a way which doesn't involve the steep and sort of cemented hierarchy that lies behind meritocracy.
Yeah, Lakshmi, she was talking about meritocracy. It is merit. It is about the difference between the salary that people are getting. Some good jobs, they get more paid, and some less good job, they get paid less pay, even though the jobs are equally important. In Cuba, they just get paid the same, and according to their ability, they'll get paid that way. Do you have any opinion about it?
Yes, well, 2 things to say about that. The first is, of course, that these differentials in pay and differentials in income have increased hugely over the last 30 years or so. I think I mentioned earlier that in my first school, the head teacher I guess he would have been earning about 2.5 times what I earned as a first-year teacher. These days, the differential would be huge. So the first thing to say is that this is an issue that has got bigger and bigger. The second thing is that I agree that actually very often the roles into which people are promoted end up being easier than the jobs they're promoted out of. And in one school I taught at, there was somebody who was clearly a good teacher. He was then promoted to be in charge of external exams, which meant he sat in a room doing a administrative job all day, a very important administrative job, but you didn't need a teacher to do that. So I'm actually quite cynical about the need to pay these people who've risen up through the meritocracy as much as they are paid. And, I'd just say 2 other words in relation to that. Vice Chancellor.
Yeah, I think Lakshmi is also saying that merit is a word used as a sort of rationalization of paying people a higher wage. You've got to give an excuse. You've got to justify paying people a lot of money. So you've got to create a delusion, a fallacy to do it. And merit is the fallacy, the delusion that's been created.
I think that's brilliantly put, Francis. I wish I'd said that. I think that's really important. And you see, it is a fallacy because people complain if top executives get paid a lot of money when their business fails, but then they sort of say, oh, but if the business is going all right, they do deserve their 500,000. I won't accept that at all. As you say, Francis, it's a delusion.
The other thing that you mentioned in your presentation, you talked about social mobility and that meritocracy not enabling that. In fact, meritocracy can break down the social fabric of society. And some people say Michael Young predicted the present, though he didn't know it at the time. And that is that if you do have an entrenched meritocracy, you do create an underclass, and in a democracy, eventually they will fight back. And some people say Young therefore predicted populism. Do you share that view?
I absolutely do share that view. As I think I said earlier, I don't think I'm being controversial in suggesting that the results of the EU referendum and the results of the presidential election in the US were to do with populism. And I'm not taking sides at all on that. I think there would be general acceptance that there was a group of people who felt hard done by, and therefore they react in a very emotional way to the issues that are put to them. And that's my definition of populism, because it seems to me that populism is anti-intellectual.
Yeah, I mean, many people have argued that. Farid Hashinoff also raises two questions. It's very sort of complex, but one, he talks about Trump. You know, some people say the guy's got a very low IQ. Some people say he's a genius. And how do you actually measure? I mean, you've talked about intelligence tests and not being able to rely on those and not being very valuable or reliable. I mean, how can you really measure merit? If you talk about merit, what is it?
Well, I would say that you can't measure it for several reasons. First of all, I think you were absolutely right to suggest earlier that merit is just a word that's thrown around when the rich want to justify their salaries. I think there's a lot of truth in that. But I think another key important point, and I promise not to go into the depths of complexity theory at 10 to 8, but another important point to realize is that we can know things without being able to measure them. Now, people find it difficult to get their head around that, but let me illustrate that very simply by going back into my presentation. Now, if you look at that, you can know that the coastline of Ireland, over on the left there, is much smaller, much less than the coastline of mainland Britain, England, Scotland, and Wales. But you cannot measure the length of a coastline. Anybody who says you can measure the length of a coastline doesn't understand fractal geometry. I can explain it very simply. You imagine you can walk along as a human being along the coastline. It's very irregular, but then you take your pet mouse with you, and your pet mouse will walk considerably further if that's going to stay near this, right next to the sea, because it will go in and out a lot. So we can know that one coastline is bigger than the other, even though we can't measure it. You can be absolutely certain that Andras Schiff is a far, far better piano player than I am. You can be absolutely certain of that. But that doesn't mean to say that you can get all the piano players in the world, let alone the saxophone players, and line them up in a row and say in rank order. So and this fits in with complexity theory. You can know things that are not measurable.
Okay, and Farad asked another question. He says that because of the growth of people having to pay for their education in the United States, particularly the growth of private universities, people can buy their meritocracy, and that creates even more entrenchment.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. But I think it actually goes further than that, because I would say that the obsession with measuring achievements, so I'm talking about, whether you're measuring effort, whether you're measuring merit or whatever, but the obsession with measuring that comes from the influence of money and privatization into, say, education. Because if you're going to privatize a service, you have to have allegedly objective measures against which you can say whether the contract has been met. Now, if you're talking about emptying dustbins, and I've got no disrespect to the people who do an excellent job, certainly in our area, emptying the dustbins, no disrespect to them, but it's easier to measure the output of emptying the dustbins in linear terms, in numerical terms, than it is educating somebody. But if we're going to outsource, we have to measure and we have to have competition. So it really is a vicious circle, I think. Does that make sense, what I'm saying in relation to that? Hope it does.
Yeah, no, that makes sense indeed. And I mean, I like what you said in your presentation, which most of us know about, and that is that people are often in a meritocratic society promoted to their level of incompetence.
Yes.
And that's always a worrying factor, which leads on maybe to the last question. We come in near to the end, and it's a question that that I think is really worth looking at in some depth. And it's Lakshmi again. She's basically saying that what's more important than merit is value in society. You pay a vice chancellor £600,000, you pay a care worker very little. And the question is not who has the most merit, but who adds the most value to society. That should be the determining factor in the world we live in.
I agree. And you see, what we have actually seen over the last 30 years is a huge increase in these differentials. But at the same time, we've seen, I suggest, a huge decrease in the trust that people have in those who manage and govern and are at the top. No, I mean, I would say the trust in those people has never been less in my lifetime than it is at the moment. And yet they've never earned more. So something's going quite seriously wrong, I would suggest.
I said that was the last question, but Neil has brought another one up, which is equally interesting. And that is saying that, one of the things about a hierarchical organization of society is how important obedience is. Mm-hmm. People find it very difficult to say no, and they say yes. He says 30 times a day. They don't question. They're afraid to question. It damages their promotional chances. Yep. And what we're doing is creating, if you like, a sort of an intelligentsia, an hierarchy that we call a meritocracy. But it's just a bunch of people who are fighting for promotion, won't question the system, and follow the line of least resistance.
Yes. So, Neil, I've just invented a new word, thanks to your question, and that's the obedienceocracy, that we are ruled by people who are yes people. And, this has also got worse over the last 30 to 40 years. I can remember in the third school I worked at, they brought in some new system, some new assessment system. And I said, I'm not doing that in the music department. We're not going to do that. And the head said, well, you've got to do it. And I said, well, I'm not doing it. And I got away with it. These days, I'd be booted out. When I worked for the London Education Authority, I refused to obey a reasonable instruction. And I'm not, I'm normally like this, but the point I'm making is that those small acts of saying, I'm not going to do this because I don't believe in it, were accepted 30 or so years ago. You'd just be kicked out now. So we end up with an obedienceocracy of yes people.
So you're saying, in a way, that management structures today are really the institutionalization of merit?
Yes, that's the management structures, and it's more than just the management structures, it's the disallowing of any sort of dissent. And when I talk to people, particularly people in higher education and people I know who've just retired from higher education, and I put my concerns to them, they say, yes, you're absolutely right. But people are a bit afraid, and for understandable reasons, to make those criticisms openly. And you see, again, if I can say one more point, it's worse than that, because when I was a young teacher, because the differential in wages wasn't so great, and because house prices were more sensible, I was able to buy a small house. These days, the only way a young teacher could hope to buy a house is by climbing up the greasy pole of obedience and becoming an assistant head teacher and so on. So it's much harder for people to resist and raise their objections to things they don't believe in now than it was when I was younger.
Okay, well, we come sort of pretty close to the end, so let's sort of finish it there and say that this discussion has opened a whole can of worms. It's raised a lot of questions about what a meritocratic society is. It's led us into questions about how we institutionalize the inequality of wealth, and how we do not value people who are valuable. And I think this is something we ought to take up again and look at in more detail on some of the very interesting points that people have brought up here, like Farid and Lakshmi and Neil and so on, which I think have been really, really interesting. So thank you, Terry, for taking part of this. Thank you for starting the debate and getting us to think about it, and let's hope we carry it on. And thank you to everyone else who has come on here and who has contributed with their questions. As I said, this will be recorded and it will be available for dissemination, and I'm sure we'll follow this up again. So thank you everyone for joining, and let's leave this webinar now. Thank you everyone.
Thank you.